Okay, we're almost ready to start here. Um, do you do you guys have uh, folks who are interested in modding? I mean,
I personally couldn't find anybody.
oh, it's
I
okay.
had no one reached out to me either.
It's
But
all right. Oh well, there's between the three of us, I think we could probably handle it.
yeah.
We are actually live now, just so you know. Do you guys
Oh
have
gosh. Okay. Well, all right. Let
and
me know if you hear any like background noise because there are like other people in the house and stuff.
cool. Um, well, it looks like there's only two folks here so far, so gonna take some time to just kind of get in the swing of things and probably just hang out for a couple minutes before we actually get this show on the road.
Drop
All right.
links everywhere.
True.
Yeah.
Uh, you guys want to like go around the proverbial table and talk about our backgrounds with leftist politics or anything?
I think we should wait until a couple more folks are here, frankly. Like, I think, it's a good idea, but we should wait until there's a couple more folks in the chat. Feel me?
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right.
Yo, by the way, have either of you guys heard of Spartacus Education, like the website?
I don't think
Or
so.
sorry, Spartacus Educational. Yeah, like it's just like two or three dudes who really like um basically like pre 1945 European history, and they just have like literally everything you could possibly think of compiled on one website. And they focus on the German Revolution, and that's where I got like a lot of secondary sources.
Oh, that's
Like
great.
outside of the
That's very
yeah, yeah.
cool.
So it looks like we've got about 6 folks watching.
Hey.
All right, I think this would probably be as good as time as any to start, so let me just switch over to our screen here and we'll get the show on the road. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to our live stream study group of the German Revolution, 1918 to 1923 by Pierre Broué. I'm joined here by Simba and Kyle. Unfortunately, our comrade Izzy wasn't able to join us. But hi, I'm Melody. I'm the host of this channel, A World to Win, and I thought we could get things started by just going around and saying your name, your pronouns, maybe a little bit about your background, what you hope to get out of this study stream, and anything else, like what you do on your respective YouTube channels, that kind of thing. Take it away.
Simba, after you.
Okay, all right. My name is Simba Rache, if you want to be formal. And my YouTube channel is kind of in the works, but yeah, I'm Zimbabwean, so that informs a lot of what I do and what I say on the internet. Um, Maybe you know, maybe you don't. Zimbabwe, as well as Mozambique, had their respective Marxist-Leninist uprisings, which weren't like full-fledged civil wars or anything, but basically sub-Saharan African history is like something I'm very, very interested in. And I got into Marxism because for my, I think it was like 11th or 12th birthday, I asked for the Communist Manifesto, and my dad was like, you know what? Kid likes history. so so
Fucking
that's where
awesome.
I'm at. But I went on to college, uh, didn't finish, but I did computer science. So not, I'm kind of a layman here. I'm learning just as much as the audience is. So there you go, Kyle.
That's fucking rad. The birthday story. I love that. And then I'm glad you're launching YouTube stuff. It's very cool. My name is Kyle. I'm at laborkyle on literally everything. I'm a grad student, uh, soon to not be one. I am finishing the last chapter of my thesis project literally in December, which I'm very excited to be done with that. I My background is in like classical studies and ancient history. Actually, I came up in undergrad studying that sort of a thing, but during that entire time, I was becoming progressively more radical in terms of politics. It started out on some decent footing in high school, and then used that as a means for interpreting the world that used a lot of Karl Marx, that used a lot of the history of the labor movement in the United States to kind of, undergird my ideology. And as a result, now I'm here. Uh, yeah, I study antiquity, specifically religion. My project is on the Apostle Paul, actually. I study literature, the way that literature manifests itself as a result of people's sort of conscious underpinnings. It uses some Marxist thinkers like Walter Benjamin, for example, in my sort of theoretical stuff that I'm making up as I go along, like we all are. But other than that, my background, I'm a first generation college student. I come from a very, very blue collar family, a very reactionary. I love them, but with a family with not great politics. So I decidedly flipped in the other direction pretty early on, and as a result, I'm here. Out of the live stream, I love early 20th century history. I'm very interested in the German Revolution, as well as in the Bolshevik Revolution and the Revolution of 1905, as well as not elements of 19th century history. But I am not the best like source, the most well-read person on the German Revolution, because no matter how much, like even if your job is talking about books in front of people who then go read the books that you tell them to, there's still infinite number of things to read and infinite number of ways to grow on the left, especially using history. All I can hope is that my formalized historical background can lend something to helping friends and comrades understand more about these very important topics, and that I can continue to, see myself as one of many, in spite of formalized training in history, rather than of some bullshit, hoity-toity fucking academic elite crap that we all know is just kayfabe nonsense. End of speech.
Well put, comrade. Um, I guess I'll top it off.
Nice.
I'm Melody. I use she/her pronouns, and my background is in physics. I just have an undergrad degree, so uh, I'm learning this stuff as I go. Definitely not an expert on German history at all. I consider myself a Marxist-Leninist, and so my perspective is kind of informed by that. Um, I think we're just going to go ahead and get into it. Uh, Welcome to our live stream discussion of the German Revolution, 1918 to 1923, by Pierre Broué. There are many important reasons why we should be intimately familiar with the German Revolution today. The crises of imperialism and capitalism, the reemergence of the far right and fascist movements in the Eurosphere, as well as the revival of a radical left, labor unions, and social movements. In this series of streams, we'll be going through Broué's book a few chapters at a time, taking the time to digest and discuss the material in depth. As I said in our previous stream talking about On New Terrain by Kim Moody, none of us here are experts. We're all four friends, well, unfortunately, without Izzy today, but we found each other on the internet, basically. We have varying levels of education and different left political affiliations, and we've worked together to present this material to you. As I said, we're learning this stuff right alongside with you, our viewers, so think of this stream as a live study group. But keep in mind, we're not a panel of professors, and we won't be able to answer all your questions, so this is, yeah, as I said, we're all learning together. I'd like to take a minute to let's remind our viewers of the YouTube walkout from December 10th to 13th. We will not be uploading, watching, or streaming on YouTube in protest of YouTube's new terms of service, which threaten to delete channels which YouTube deems not commercially viable, a provision which, as we know from past experience, means that disproportionately LGBTQ, non-white, and leftists and other smaller channels will be targeted for deletion. We're asking for our audience to join us to protest YouTube's disrespect for its creators. We all work hard to make our videos, to spread educational materials, provide alternative perspectives on current events, and YouTube profits from exploiting this labor. From December 10th to 13th, don't visit YouTube, don't upload any videos, and don't watch any videos. Tell your friends, your Instagram and Twitter followers, Facebook friends, and your friends and coworkers in real life about what's going on. It's a good time to remind them that this is their fight too, not just because they watch YouTube videos themselves, but because they too are having their labor exploited by their bosses, and importantly, they too can organize with their coworkers and community members to join or form unions and fight back against poverty wages, poor working conditions, racism and sexism on the job site, and any number of other injustices that we face under white supremacist patriarchal capitalism. As atomized individuals, we are easy to defeat, but when we get together and act in solidarity, we can stand strong. When we fight, we win. I also wanted to take just a moment to make a quick plug for Haymarket Books, which is the publisher that printed this edition of Pierre Broué's book that we're going through. All titles are 50% off right now for the holidays, so make sure to run over to haymarketbooks.org and load up on as many radical reading choices as you can. In fact, you can get yourself a copy of the book we've been reading for just $25 right now, which is an absolute steal for the sheer size and quality of this book. If that's out of your price... Oh, thank you. Kyle is showing that off in the... So... if that's out of your price range, or think maybe a big old 900-page book is a little bit too academic, but you still want to follow along with our stream series, you can pick up a copy of Chris Harmon's book called The Lost Revolution, which is much shorter and much more accessible, less academic, etc. Just to be clear, Haymarket Books is not an official sponsor. We don't get any money from them. I just happen to really love this fantastic independent leftist publishing house, so please make sure to check them out, along with others like Red Star Publishers, AK Press, PM Press, Palgrave Macmillan, Pluto Press, Verso Books, and many, many, many others. So
Zero Books too.
Oh, yeah, Zero Books.
Yeah.
Big fan. Yeah, if you're going to get something from Zero Books, I'd recommend there's this great short little book. It's not more than 100 pages. It's called A Serf's Journal by Terry Tapp, which is the history, a first-hand account of the longest wildcat strike in American history, which was the, I think it's the shipyard strike of Jeff Boat in 2001. So it's a great little book. Get yourself acquainted with contemporary American working class history. So let's go ahead and get into to our historical background here. So before we start talking about this pivotal moment in the history of the socialist movement, we should have a solid grasp of the landscape it took place in, both in terms of world history and with regards to the specifics of Germany. The 19th century, in broad terms, can be said to mark the transition from early industrial capitalism to monopoly capitalism and imperialism. With this, a transition from relatively small-scale industry that Adam Smith had spoken of in The Wealth of Nations to the gargantuan factories and swelling urban populations detailed by Karl Marx in Capital. As this mega-scale industrial capitalism developed, the capitalist nations strove to expand their markets to ever more pockets of the earth, as Vladimir Lenin described in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. This process manifested in many ways across the capitalist world, such as the British control of India, the American westward expansion and extermination of indigenous nations, and the increasing tensions between these empires as they sought to continually expand the limits of their reach. This dynamic interaction of capitalism and imperialism, which characterized the geopolitical terrain of the late 19th and early 20th century, was described by future U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who wrote, quote, "Since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outreached in the process. Colonies must be obtained or planted in order that no useful corner of the world may be overlooked or left unused." Oh, right from the horse's mouth. Naked imperialism. Along with this highly developed system of geopolitical rivalries based on the drive for greater and greater economic expansion, this expansion could not have been possible without the dramatic expansion of the working classes that could work these massive new industrial centers. The conditions that these workers toiled in were horrific. Child labor was prevalent, and slavery persisted in some forms, such as via the 13th Amendment in the United States. But this new working class wasn't just going to take it lying down. The 19th century saw countless strikes, rebellions, and even revolutions in some cases. Marx and Engels famously wrote, "A specter is haunting Europe, a specter of communism," in the 1848 Communist Manifesto. Revolutions and uprisings took place all over Europe, from Paris to Berlin, from Sicily to Vienna that year, only to be bloodily subdued by the following year. Nevertheless, the idea that the center could not be contained. Despite their defeats, as historian Chris Harman wrote, quote, "The revolutions did not leave Europe completely unchanged, however. In Germany and Austria, they brought about the end of the feudal payments and serfdom, although on terms which transformed the landowning Junkers, noblemen, into agrarian capitalists that did little for the peasants. The monarchs of most German states conceded constitutions which left them with power to appoint governments, but provided for parliamentary representation for the moneyed classes, and even, in a diluted form, for the workers and the peasants. The ground was cleared for capitalist advance, even if it was capitalist advance under monarchies which prevented the bourgeoisie itself from exercising direct control over the state." End quote. The U.S. working class also went through a period of bloody rebellion in this epoch. In the years after the end of the Civil War in 1865, the global economy went through a period known as the Long Depression, a prolonged economic downturn on a similar scale of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It took place between 1873 and 1896. Working class militancy surged. There were major strikes all across the country, such as in 1877 there was a railroad strike, and again another railroad strike in 1894. The 1890s were also the period in which the working class-based People's Party reached the peak of its influence. 1871 was also a pivotal moment in the history of the world socialist movement. For a short time, the working class of Paris took over and ran the country with a radically democratic form of self-government, only to be brutally subdued with the help of the Prussian army. The putting down of the Paris Commune cost the lives of an estimated 20 to 30,000 workers, with an additional 40,000 imprisoned. And actually, that estimate of 20 to 30,000 is thought to be a rather conservative estimate, according to more recent scholarship on the Paris Commune. With worldwide foment as the backdrop, we arrive at the beginning of our journey, the late 19th century Germany. Germany before 1871 was not yet Germany, not yet a unified state, but a strange mix of other kingdoms with varying degrees of parliamentary democracy and other forms of government. The end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 with the crushing of the Paris Commune also came with the naming of William I of Prussia as the Emperor of Germany. What was soon to become the largest and most successful socialist party in Europe, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, was formed in 1863. It grew rapidly in popularity, so much so that the anti-socialist laws were enacted to curb its influence. Although the laws did not outright ban the SPD, they did make it many of the party's activities illegal, forcing the party to effectively operate illegally as an illegal organization between 1878 and 1890, when the German parliament, the Reichstag, refused to renew those laws. So that gives us a pretty solid backdrop of what world history, is admittedly a bit Eurocentric, but that's kind of our backdrop to what we're talking about in the context of Broué's book. And of course, can't forget, World War I is the devastating consequence of this ultimate eruption of imperialism and the crises of capitalism. So I think now I'm going to hand things over to Kyle to talk about the preface and kind of get us further solidified as we move forward in talking about this book. So Kyle, if you're ready, please go ahead and take it away.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, that was a really, really good summary of a great deal of information, because the subject is not easy. And the particularities of, I think, German history present barriers, like a fairly high barrier to entry when it comes to understanding the broader context. I think, Melody, I think you did a really good job, in particular because, like, within the context of leading up in the 18th and the 19th century, in the backdrop of the larger things that are happening in Europe and then across the Atlantic and North America, there's this sort of consistent, like, post-early modern, like the transition into like what we understand as modernity, which is mostly the end of the 18th and the early parts of the 19th century, we're really resulting in a great deal of social upheaval in a lot of places. And I think part of the problem for people who don't live in Europe and people who, don't get a bunch of European history, if we're all in the United States, for example, like we talk a lot about European history in school, but still don't quite have a firm understanding of sort of the changes and the alterations that were occurring in this time period, in particular in Germany, because I think we take for granted, in the same way that a lot of folks, myself included, historically in our minds take for granted the things like the unification of Italy, for example, which wasn't very long ago. I think the unification of Germany under sort of like Prussian installation with Kaiser Wilhelm and stuff is something that has kind of been pushed out of our consciousness. So the idea that,
if I may just bring something up, it's interesting to note that if you were born in, say, like 1920, so you were 99 years old right now, and you were born in say, Berlin or something, you would have lived in the Weimar Republic,
yes,
East Germany, Nazi Germany, and the FRG. That's
yes,
4 different versions of Germany. So to put that in perspective, just imagine that, living in the same place but 4 different countries.
Yes. Oh, no,
sorry to cut you off, but
no, please. I'm glad you did, because that's the perfect example. Because there's a strong continuation, and we're going to see, in particular in the preface, I'll get into it. I won't ramble for too long before I get into my section, but you see that there's this sort of there are these threads of instability that we can follow throughout, not just the 18th and 19th century, but into the 20th century as well in this region. It's very important to put out, and it's important to point that out, and I think that's a really good way of doing it. And in particular, the unification of Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm, with sort of this Prussian installed like driving force behind it, transitioned out the Northern Germanic Confederation and the Württemberg Kingdom and Hesse and Bavaria and all of these regions that do really have their own unique expressions, identities, and understandings of the world, being united with this development of a new idea of German nationalism. But basically this long period of time where the Germanic people were trying to figure out exactly what their place was in this newly modernizing Europe. That's all to say that the summary is very, very good and very helpful, because when we get into the first parts of this book, I think the preface is really unique and interesting, because our writer has decided to utilize something that's not necessarily the most popular thing in historical writing, but he does a little bit of historical fiction in the beginning, but he does so in a way I think that's really the right way to do it. He takes a speech from Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, I believe, to essentially construct this alternative history in which the German Revolution was sort of successful. I have a short section, but a lot of the text itself is very useful and very compelling, so I figured I'd just read directly from it a little bit. This is the very beginning of the preface. In 1970, in the Great Lecture Theater of the Polytechnic Museum in Moscow, one of the main cities of the United Socialist States of Europe, a history lecture is being given dealing with the Russian Revolution, which opened the way for the victory of socialism in Europe. The professor Fitter had just recalled the difficult conditions of the struggle during the first years of the Soviet state, the obstacles created by the rural and backward nature of the country and its initial isolation. He explains, if the revolution in the West had been delayed too long, this situation could have led to an aggressive socialist war by Russia, supported by the European proletariat, against the capitalist West. This did not happen because the proletarian revolution was by this time already knocking at the door, owing to its own inner development. And basically, it's a speech being given by Bolshevik, and the idea is that he's projecting outward sort of an image of the potential for the changes that could occur across Western Europe should the German Revolution actually be successful. Broué discusses the potentials that could have occurred, a signal for a civil war, that German workers emerged victorious from attacks against the French and Polish capitalist government, and the Soviet Union coming in to respond to this. Workers essentially triumphing in a more of a stricter domino falling process than one would expect, actually knowing the history. He continues with the speech, and then firmly brings us back to reality, saying that in 1922, this young communist leader imagined that this would be how a half a century later, a generation would be taught about the unfolding of a final struggle for socialism in Europe. However, we know that this isn't exactly what happened. But I think it's very meaningful what he's doing, because this is something that I've thought about quite a bit. And I think people who study European history and who are on the left also are invested in. Historically, they have been. Would have the events that we're going to be learning about today, we're kind of leading up to it, but should they have been more successful? Should those at the center of it not been perhaps portrayed in the ways in which they were? Should some of the different levers of history change? Where would Europe be right now? And basically, he uses this and he does this frequently throughout the text. He uses it to sort of contextualize his study within the sources that he's paying to his benefit, the sources that he's paying very, very close attention to. Because in what he's doing in this preface is setting up the particular type of history that he's writing. And this is a little bit of the inside baseball here, but I honestly think it really matters. And his preface is very short, but is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because Broué, in spite of being, decidedly on in this case, the Trotskyist left, he is writing within a tradition of historiography, a tradition of a certain type of historical writing that is very clear. Clearly, it's not exclusively from within a Marxist tradition. It reminds me of the French Annales school, started by Marc Bloch and Faber, other French and German writers who were typically killed by the Nazis. But basically, it's this type of historical writing that was popularized in the early parts of the 20th century, leading up to the middle of the 20th century, I should say, that prioritized what they called like a longue durée of history. Basically, they didn't want to give just a snapshot of history. They wanted to do social history. They wanted to talk about the mechanisms of society from the top to the bottom and from the beginning to the end, give as much of a picture as possible. I think we can see that there's some of this going on here. The difference being, and this is what I think is really compelling and what brings us back to his preface, is that Broué is focusing on a particular political representation of this type of history. And I think it's really important because a lot of the sources that he's working with, and we'll talk about sort of his limitations and sources at some point, I imagine, are transcriptions of speeches and this sort of a thing. This is what he's using for his context. And I think he manages to do something very remarkable by creating more of a narrative in this preface. In this case, it's using a speech to construct an imagined history. It makes me think of the book Lenin Lives, which came out a few years ago.
Is that Philip Cunliffe?
Yes. That little small work that sort of interweaves historical imagination. Basically, it's Kaiserreich and Hearts of Iron is what it makes me think of.
It's a great title from Zero Books.
Yeah. Yes. Zero Books. Actually, that is true. It's this very interesting way of taking the limitations you have in your sources, as well as the limitations for him at this time in the methodology of political history. It could be really kind of where the stuffy old fucks go, is to talk about political history. But instead, what he does is he takes this more modern French kind of historiography, this French way of historical writing, because he's a French guy, if you can't tell by his name, and then combines it with political history in a way that acknowledges the limitations of his sources, but still does something interesting and creative with it. And which brings me back to basically the last part of the preface, is that he's discussing something that's a big part of this book, some of pushing back against other elements of the historiography around the German Revolution. He specifically references, I wish he would more consistently in his footnotes, is one of my only criticisms for him. I need more comprehensive footnotes from him. But he talks about, in his words, commentators drawing conclusions that suited their ideology and their politics. And in this case, what he's discussing is a historiography that is trying to determine that the German Revolution was this interval. It basically, the stopover between the Russian Revolution and then the crazy stuff that broke out with World War I. Or, for example, an extension of what someone called the mass psychosis of the besieged that was occurring during the Paris Commune, which is this old school psychohistory bullshit. It basically removes agency from working people and just says they all got swept up in this revolutionary fervor where they woke up in the day, and because everyone was yelling and running around, they wanted to go start chopping off people's heads and killing people, which is it's silly. It's a silly idea. Basically, throughout the book, he's trying to push back against this narrative and say, no, there were not only more specific mechanisms going on here that caused things to happen the way that they did, but this is historical teleology. This was not an inevitability. These are events that occurred from people who were free historical agents, like a good Marxist believes. But basically, he uses the idea of the Nazis' rise to power as a framing for him pushing back against this historiography, because he talks about sort of the Marxist tradition of referring to this as a counter-revolution, based off of the German Revolution. And in large ways, this is correct, considering he gets into the specifics here, which is great. My personal specialty of like evil Nazi fucks that started out, doing evil Nazi shit before the Nazi Party even came around. But he talks about people who are affiliated with the Condor League, which is that's the group of Nazis that went to go help the Spanish nationalists in the Spanish War. Individuals who eventually moved into like the center of the levers of power during the Nazi regime. Those fascists were a part of this sort of counter-revolutionary fervor that jumped up around the German Revolution. He's using this to basically just to say the idea that this is a stopover is kind of ridiculous because there was a firm, real, concerted, and in many ways organized opposition to this. So he's essentially trying to be dialectical in a lot of ways with the way that he's approaching this work. And he basically rounds out the preface by talking about there's no simple explanation for these events, thus big old book, but how like different poles, speaking of dialectical thinking, he sets up these poles that were, pushing and pulling against one another during these historical events, activism and passivity, sectarianism and revisionism, sort of these levers that were moving back and forth throughout that were sort of driving these ideas forward. That essentially he's using the amount of documents that he has. He gets into the documents a little bit, but talking about how there are essentially portions of archives that are closed to him to where he's not able to actually reconstruct things as well as he could, though he did have access to some sources that people didn't previously, which is part of where this work comes as an improvement. But basically, at the end of the preface, it's about this is what he starts out by saying, this is what someone within this context imagined how this could go. Do you think that everyone within this context was thinking, oh, well, let's start the German Revolution, which is bound to fail and not actually going to follow through. We're not going to be able to do anything. Like nothing else is going to happen in Europe. It's like, no, that's kind of a silly idea. We need to interrogate and investigate as much as we can in the lead up and the events occurring during the German Revolution to figure out what happened and why it happened, as opposed to, reducing ourselves to this idea of, well, it was bound to fail. And actually, I think that's basically the preface that sums it up, I would say. And then some, probably.
Okay, so we got, I think Simba is going to cover chapter 1, so if you're ready to do that, go ahead and take it away.
All right, yeah. So I do want to just throw out a warning. Like, I'm not the only person in my house right now, and I have to respect that. So if you guys hear something in the background or it's difficult to hear me, I need to repeat something, please let me know in the chat. I'll be looking at that a whole bunch. But let's just get it going. So chapter 1 is all about basically the preconditions and the reaction before the actual reaction happens to the notion of a workers' revolution. So by preconditions, I mean, Engels and Marx generally argued that the preconditions for an actual revolution are that the society has to be mostly working class. And that happens, from the point of primitive accumulation to proletarianization to industrialization, that kind of thing. So it starts off a society generally starts off having mostly peasants, and then those peasants generally move into urban centers, and then you have an industrial revolution and they are workers, and wage labor takes place, all of that stuff. And then there has to be a development of class consciousness. And it can't be false consciousness wherein, you're blaming all of the economic problems you might be having on this or that idea, or people think oh, if I just say the right thing, or if I bargain with rich people the right way, maybe they'll just throw us some bones. Actually understanding the dialectical relationship and the contradictions between capital and labor. So those are the first two: majority working class society, development of class consciousness, and then the third general precondition that needs to be met for a proletarian revolution to take place is effective methods of organization among the working class. That doesn't just mean workers' cooperatives. That doesn't just mean unions, or as Marx and Engels referred to them, combinations. That also means that there might have to be a certain political party that engages in both savory and unsavory activities in order to get some type of goals done. So there they are: majority working class society, development of class consciousness, and effective methods of organization. And according to Marx and Engels' consideration of those criteria, Germany was kind of like in the place to be for the reasons that I'm about to list. The economic development of Germany cannot be separated from the fact that Germany was like kind of a new thing, because there were a bunch of warring nations, as both Melody and Kyle mentioned. There were a bunch of warring nations, the largest of which being Prussia. And the thing that kind of, or one of the things that Broué argues kind of brought them together was their natural resources. As many of us might know, Germany has a whole lot of metal, and they've got a whole lot of coal. And around like 1913, Germany became like the second largest producer of coal like in the world. And coal back then is like oil right now, except for, the United States won't or didn't fly halfway across the world to, bomb countries for coal. We kind of just have our own. But yeah, the second largest coal producer means that, you can open up things like public transportation. You have different forms of power. Electrification was happening around this time. Also in 1913, Germany's external trade was double France's, and was, I think Broué says, 85% of what Great Britain's was. And 85% of Great Britain is like pretty dang good, because this is 1913, but in 1917, Great Britain, something like 23% of the entire population of the world was in the British Empire. So, I mean, that obviously includes places like India, Hong Kong, very large places in Africa. So the fact that Germany could get to 85% of Great Britain's global trade, despite not having an empire that was that big, is pretty dang good. Germany also had the most widespread use of industrial electronic appliances. Electronic appliances doesn't mean like microwaves or iPhones. Like back in the day, that kind of meant electronic appliances that were made to like build things, and that could have been heavy industry, or it could have been light bulbs. Just any kind of appliance that was useful for businesses and stuff. So like you can kind of see that like places like Hamburg and I think the cities along the Rhine were starting to like really urbanize, and like they were starting to build up their productive forces to a point that Marx and Engels probably would have said like, this is the spot to be, other than the United States, like the spot to be, like a proletarian revolution. Very quickly, the right wing kind of realized that, and there are industrial, our industrial overlords, or their industrial overlords of the time, kind of noticed that. There's a guy named Emil Kerdorf, who Broué mentions at some point, I think, in the section called "An Incomplete Bourgeois Revolution." He was a textile manufacturer who was the son of the textile manufacturer, and he, around this time, around 1913, and this went on, I think, until the 20s, like the mid-20s, he put like very, very large effort into crushing trade unions and stuff, because he noticed that all of a sudden, like, people in the urban centers were starting to say like, hey, we're getting the short end of the stick, and starting to organize. And he put like a very large effort into that. And this is kind of an aside. This is outside of the context of the book, but Emil Kerdorf ended up hearing a speech from Hitler in 1926, I believe. And and he was like, "Hey, I love all of this stuff except for the part about workers' rights." And I think the year after, Hitler put out a pamphlet that he distributed among the industrial giants that basically said, like, "Hey, the workers' rights stuff is just like, to get the middle class on our side. We're not actually going to do any of the making people's lives better thing. That's what we're not concerned with." so so beyond that, the other industrial giants kind of started to notice, and they influenced a whole lot of politicians like in the Reichstag to unite people around nation, and so this is one of the places where nationalism was sort of born, and Broué goes over this in the section called nationalism or socialism. And here's just like a quote from the first paragraph. If war is declared, the working classes in the countries affected, as well as their parliamentary representatives, have the duty to mobilize their forces to prevent hostilities from breaking out, with the support of coordinating activity of the International Bureau, by applying those means, which will seem the most effective to them, means which evidently will vary according to the more or less aggravated turn which the class struggle may take, and in relation to the general political situation. If, in spite of their efforts, war should break out, their duty is to struggle and for a speedy end to the fighting, and to make every effort to use the economic and political crisis which the war causes to rouse the people, and in this way speed up the abolition of the rule of the capitalist class. And like basically the right wing wanted the antithesis of that. Um, they wanted to like take that and turn it on its head. So there's this guy named Vermeil. I don't, pardon the pronunciation, but Vermeil. And Broué says Vermeil shown how National Socialism and Hitlerite anti-Semitism had their roots in the efforts of the ruling classes to tear the proletarian masses away from international revolutionary ideology. At the opening of the 20th century, anti-Semitism, which August Bebel called the socialism of fools, I'm compelled to agree, had been the means for diverting the anger of the petty bourgeoisie, who were crushed in the development of big capital and were threatened with being driven down into the proletariat. It's no like given Brouet's analysis, it's no surprise to know that both Kerdorf and Vermeil were very, very concerned with the financial sector, quote unquote.
Means the
um,
Jews.
yeah, I'll let you fill in the blank there. And not so much concerned with the concentration of a whole lot of power in very few hands, like in the form of capital. They weren't very interested in corporate consolidation. They were much more interested in nose lengths and skull shapes. Um, and so those were sort of the preconditions and the reaction before it actually manifested in any meaningful way of any kind of proletarian revolution in Germany. Maybe not as shiny and polished as Kyle's analysis, but that's what I got.
I'm not polished in any way, shape, or form. That was very good. Like,
Appreciate it.
don't
Appreciate it.
put yourself down. That was very good.
Kyle was just pointing out that probably creating some noise over here on my end because I actually can't mute my mic without muting the entire stream. Thanks Skype and Streamlabs
The
for
fuck,
that.
Skype.
Um, I'd just like to take a moment. We have about 15 folks joining us live right now, so I just thought I'd say hello and welcome to my channel, and make sure to go subscribe to Simba's channel and Kyle's channel, and follow all of us on Twitter as well. I think before Kyle offered to cover Izzy's summary of Chapter 2. Izzy, unfortunately, had an emergency and couldn't join us. Um, so Kyle will be covering her chapter in just a
Yeah.
moment, but just thought we'd take just a quick second to welcome the new folks and just add a little bit of breath into our live cast here. We're basically doing a live study group. We've all read this short selection from this very, very big book. Kyle, if you want to show that off again, what a
Oh yeah,
tank of a book this is. It's almost
it's
1,000 pages
It is a
long.
the
this
academic
is
term is a fucking doorstop.
Yeah.
I think that's controversial. I think the current argument is whether or not to call it a thick boy, as some would say.
Yeah, this book is definitely a thick boy. Um, so uh, let's Kyle, if you're ready, let's jump right back into it and discuss chapter 2, which is our stopping point for this week's stream, and then we'll get into a discussion. And just to our audience, if you have questions that come up in any of our summaries, make sure drop them in the chat. We'll pay attention and try our best to even if we can't answer them directly, we'll try to kind of consult the text or think about your question, or if we can't answer it, we'll write it down and hopefully we'll answer it during our next stream. Um, so and yeah, and we're gonna make sure we can connect this. Reading history is not just a kind of a bland academic exercise. We're reading this book with a pretty intentional, political purpose in mind, because there are a lot of echoes of, um, you know, past political conflicts in the socialist movement today. Um, there's a very famous aphorism that says, "History never repeats itself, but it oftentimes rhymes." And I think that learning the history of the uh, so-called lost revolution of Germany is really key to understanding where the socialist movement is at today, and how to progress, how to situate ourselves in it. So, without further
Oh,
ado, Kyle,
do
why
you
don't you
mind?
take us through chapter 2? Oh,
Okay.
Simba, did you have something?
Yeah, I did. I actually forgot to mention like one sort of critical point, and I'll make this like super fast, so Kyle, you can get on immediately after.
We're on
Um,
schedule, so don't worry about time. We're all good.
Yes, exactly.
okay, Um, I forgot to mention that the political structure of Germany during this time period, 1918 to 1923, was incredibly backward. It wasn't quite feudal. I mean, well, it was mostly not feudal, but it definitely wasn't exactly like parliamentary as we would refer to it today.
Yeah, it wasn't
Um,
like France or the other parliamentary democracies.
right, exactly. And you did see like the political structure giving concessions and stuff. One very interesting example of this is actually of another government doing something like this, at least, is after the revolution of 1905. The Imperial Russia like kind of sort of had like an electoral structure, but like I believe the peasants only got to vote for like 3% of the government. It was sort of like that, slightly better in Germany, but it was sort of like that, where you got to elect some people, but you didn't get to elect that many people, and those people appointed the people who actually do stuff. Um, so that backwardness resulted in a lot of people calling for things like universal suffrage, which eventually they did get. I believe that was 1918, and different things like that. So yeah, just keep in
Yeah,
mind that people were pissed off. Sorry,
sure. And I
continue.
thought, yeah, sorry, the thing that actually you brought up that I want to cover before we hand things back to Kyle here is, the German. One of the reasons that this is so pivotal in the history of the world socialist movement is that, the German SPD was kind of the poster child for what Marxism could do on the political landscape. No other Marxist organization had been as big or had as deep roots in the working class as any other up to that point, and it's worthy of note that the way that the Russian Social Democratic Party was structured, um, the party that would eventually become the Bolshevik and the Menshevik factions in Russia, was profoundly influenced by the way that the Germans were operating, and so a lot of the scholarship differs on how to what extent they were trying to copy them, and in to what extent they were breaking from them. They were operating in conditions of illegality a lot more, whereas the Germans were eventually a fully legal party and institution. Um, but for the most part, I mean, especially if you look at Lenin's earlier writings, he speaks quite highly of German social democracy. It's not until kind of the betrayal of opportunism and the entrance into World War One that Lenin really turns his guns on Kautsky, of course, and but up to that point, can tell in Lenin's writings that he actually speaks very highly of the German tradition, and a lot of the Russian Social Democrats uh, saw the Germans as kind of their guiding star. So I think I think that covers about how much I wanted to
Yeah.
before, because I think we can talk more about this in the discussion because it's definitely
Okay.
highly pertinent. But Kyle, go ahead and let's talk about chapter 2.
So this is really good. Y'all really like led straight up into a couple of the very clear points that are coming up in chapter 2. And in particular, I think the most important point, Simba, what you were pushing toward, and I think I honestly I think what they did very well in explaining is that they're like there's this correlation between like varying levels of political instability and then the factional responses that rise to address that political instability. And you can see it in this region throughout the entirety of the 19th century and then all the way up into the 20th century, even after the time period that we're going to be discussing with regard to this book. It's the scaffolding of this sort of historical situation that we find ourselves in. So as a result, the German SPD was able to, as Melody was talking about, was able to sort of solidify itself in a very substantive and meaningful way that very much like acted as a backdrop for a lot of the events that occurred in the early parts of the 20th century. Like this stuff is referenced. I know we all read the chapter, but surprise for everyone, this stuff leads directly into what's going on in chapter 2. Because I mean, in general, the point of the chapter is to address that these impending problems that are going to come up around 1916. That the Second International, we know by virtue of our historical goggles, because we're looking backward, that a lot of shit's going to come down on top of the heads of the Second International around 1916, especially involving tensions that are arising during the First World War. Melody was just talking about it with regard to Lenin's break with Kautsky. And that's just that it's also representative of a larger break that's occurring between the framework of social democracy, which was the radical tradition at the time, lest we not get sort of mixed up in the way that terminology changes. The way that this sort of standard for social democracy was something that was being used. And for Broué, the main point being that there's a historiographic problem. There's a problem in the retelling of this particular history when we frame these divisions, both internal and external, both from within and from without. But thinking about the German SPD, these divisions not only weren't as quite large of a problem as historians are presenting them as. Historians are presenting divisions from within the SPD as the inevitable breaks that were going to lead to what comes up in chapter 3 after I read ahead. That what's going to come up in chapter 3 talking about the opposition to the SPD, centering what will become the Spartacusbund, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht being the most notable figures of it, centering them in the analysis. But in the meantime, he's trying to contextualize these from within and from without conflicts. There's a problem that the way the historians have framed the events occurring leading up to the German Revolution within the light of these divisions. Basically, he's saying that the split between, we'll use the Social Democrats, the SPD, and then the party that eventually forms out of them, the KPD, in a break with them, the communists, represented by Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and the former being represented by Kautsky and Bebel. Basically, he wants to kind of very gently push back against these histories that have attempted to like reveal an inevitable schism that pops up around splits in 1914. But according to him, there's a lot of evidence that's demonstrating that people did not desire a split within the party. And the evidence that he uses, the example that he uses is the one that Melody was just using, which is Lenin. The idea that the dividing point that was being constructed by Kautsky and Bebel in this context, with the idea of like revolutionism, I believe is the term, was kind of pissing off Lenin, because and I'll just straight quote him here. When and where, this is Lenin speaking, when and where did I call the revolutionism of Bebel and Kautsky opportunism? When and where did I ever claim to have created any sort of special trend in international social democracy not identical with the trend of Bebel and Kautsky? When and where have there been brought to light differences between me on the one hand and Bebel and Kautsky on the other? Differences even slightly approximating in gravity the differences between Bebel and Kautsky. For instance, on the agrarian question. I mean, so basically, there's in general a lot of indignation, and he says, justified indignation. I actually agree, coming from Lenin within this, and he's using it to demonstrate the splits that he's essentially going to be tracking within the context of the SPD. And then moving on, he continues, there's a few pages of this actually, talking specifically about the models of revolutionary social democracy that were essentially being argued over within the context of the SPD at this time. And he brings up these criticisms within this, imagined split within the party, and instead, like the idea between, the revolutionaries in the party and the revisionists or the reformers in the party, and instead contextualizes it around other opportunists, as he calls them, and again, I tend to agree, that are coming from French socialists. So essentially, he's trying to situate these potential conflicts within sort of this larger idea of differences among the left in this, time and place. And then he goes back and does basically, so, which is nice. It's nice for me. I can gloss over this part, what our comrades on stream just did, and contextualizes the SPD in terms of its membership, in terms of its reach, in terms of its influence, even in spite of laws that were passed as a means for preventing them from spreading their message, they were still able to do so. And he talks about how people regarded the party as a way of life and not just this point of political engagement, that they were encountering people in organizing people on a class basis that reached into the entirety of their lives, which I think is a very remarkable point and worth walking forward and thinking about when we come back to discuss this. But basically, he outlines tendencies from within the SPD that seem to be at least relatively different from one another, and then individuals who are attached to those tendencies. And as a result is trying to say, okay, look at these tendencies that coexisted in this party, or at least for a very long time, at least up until larger rifts began to form in the Second International. Well, that leads us to sort of come to the conclusion that maybe this, the rifts were there and everyone was trying to rip each other's fucking throats out or whatever, isn't the most valid idea, especially when you place it against the backdrop of Lenin using the history of the SPD and German social democracy to frame his own ideas, and then eventually the ideas that came up during the Bolshevik Revolution. And then finally, he moves into the pole the various poles of reform versus revolution, which I think is a very interesting portion of his book. And just to really sum it up quickly, he uses this dichotomy to show that while there were cracks from within the varying tendencies of the party at the time, that these cracks didn't form into full-on breaks. But that essentially there was periods of negotiation from within the context of the SPD that people were able to sort of figure out their differences. And they had a tendency to not prioritize politicizing certain differences, and instead to reach out for negotiation. Not everyone, they were not successful always in this. And there were people who were jockeying for support in various ways. He gives examples of the way that the trade unionist organizations would align themselves in various ways with Bebel at one point, in order to sort of determine the level of power that was exercised by the trade union organizations and then the party apparatus. So there are these varying groups who were essentially jockeying for levels of power from within the context of the SPD. There was a constant process of change. I talked about his historical methodology earlier. This chapter really demonstrates that there's this constant process of change, conflict, resolution, and then evolution that was occurring between more fundamentally Marxist individuals within the party, and then others who were either more social democratic, more reformist. And then toward the end of it, he gets into people who were nationalist as well. And that's where he demonstrates, I think, the most fundamental breaks in between the sort of characteristics of the ideology of the varying factions within the context of the SPD. He essentially is just giving shape to these conflicts rather than seeing them as sectarian conflicts that come from, this person was on this party line, this version of the party line, and they believed X, Y, and Z. He instead talks about them as sort of more restorative conflicts from within the party, gives a much fairer, I think, assessment of them. I mean, he's talked about the Gotha program specifically, which I think many of us would recognize from Karl Marx's critique of the Gotha program.
You want to actually explain that real quick? Because I don't think
Yes.
we've all read that. I have,
Yeah,
but there are probably plenty of folks who haven't. So you want to do a quick parenthetical there?
Yes, absolutely. The Gotha program was essentially a party line that was being developed by the SPD. The party line included a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about, things like universal suffrage, essentially the conferring of, at the very least, the sort of liberal rights of man that in general I think some of us can get on board with. These certain sort of little pockets of freedom, if you will, of expression, association, affiliation, that kind of a thing. A decent party line program, but they wanted to get Karl Marx's take on it. It's one of the last things that he wrote. It was in the 1875. I think it was released. I think it was released posthumously. Actually, I can't remember specifically. Marx died in 1883, but anyways, it doesn't matter. So Marx released his critique of this program, and it was a critique. He was essentially saying that many elements of the Gotha program did not, just to summarize it so I'm not here all day, it didn't go quite far enough. It wasn't Marxist enough for Marx. Now, the party program, the Gotha program, was voted in, I think, with very little opposition eventually and very little change. And it sort of provided a framework for how the German social democracy was going to engage in politics. It resulted in, I believe, some successes before some failures for the SPD. And that, I think the most recognizable component would be Karl Marx's critique of it. But the Gotha program, I think, is being used by Broué in this particular context, at least the way that I interpreted it right before getting on stream, is that there is, and it's the point that I've been making. There are these schisms and conflicts that eventually grew and grew. It resulted in splits and stuff like that. And people historically look back through the split and find the split within, everything that's occurring before that. But if we're doing our history well and we're trying to get within sort of the minds of the free agents that are helming these programs and these changes and stuff, we'll find that they didn't see the future and that this stuff was inevitably going to happen. The Gotha program being an example, like there's this conflict that's happening within the SPD, and in spite of that, the SPD didn't splinter and break at that moment. At least they did eventually, but and also it's what's helped to elevate the SPD within very, very, very high levers of power within Europe to be essentially the template from which a lot of European socialist movements are using, in spite of conflicts and differences, sectarianism in some places, opportunism, accusations of sectarianism and opportunism that like always come with the left. A lot of this stuff is really relatable. There's a section that talks about placing an emphasis on electoralism versus engaging in more revolutionary activity, which none of us have ever heard that argument before. That's fucking
No, I
brand
have no idea what
new.
that's all about.
But yeah, I mean that's basically the point of chapter 2. There's some more details that I'm sure I could have dug into a little bit, but we're going a little off the cuff here. But yeah,
That's all right.
yeah.
Bernie Bros are gonna come after you, dude. Sorry.
They already
I'm pretty
they're,
sure
they're,
Bernie Bros are gonna come after all of us on the stream because I think, well, I only speak for myself, but I'm incredibly anti-electoral. I can't speak for you guys, but
Yeah, right.
um,
You are definitely.
at least in the American context, I'm very anti-electoral. Um, anyhow, so that brings us to the end of our summary. We're about just over an hour into our stream, and I think we're going to use this next hour just to respect everyone's time to talk about just kind of free-form discussion around how this text relates to our current moment, things that we found difficult or that we want to be clarifying in our future streams, talking about this and so on. And so we're going to try to incorporate questions from our chat. So I'm actually going to try to answer Eve's question. Eve asked, "Is there is the point about the SPD becoming a lifestyle as a form of promotion? Would you say that's similar to YouTube's lifestyle vlogs versus commentary channels or with diets?" So not quite. What I would say, what we're talking about when we're talking about the SPD having a lifestyle, we're talking about like the party was so incredibly popular and so deeply rooted within working class communities that you'd go to a bar that was a part like a bar that was frequented or maybe even owned by somebody who was a member of the party, and like you'd go there and you'd run into people talking working class politics and socialism and blah blah blah. And so to say that it was a way of life, also, the party was formed, I think, in, what was it, 1865, 63? I can't remember offhand, but I said it in my introduction.
Early 1860s to be sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It's
and
1863.
yeah, and so we're talking about this period here in the early 1900s to mid 19 teens. So the party's been around for at least a generation here. It's at least 40 coming on 50 years old. So to say that it's a lifestyle is to say that, um, we sometimes talk about lifestyleism in, I think more often I think we hear kind of anarchists talking about that, like living your politics. But I think in this context, what it's really talking about is a little bit more specific, is like talking about, um, you know, being educated by the party press and really like the party being kind of a living breathing organism because it was so connected to the daily lives of people. That's, I think, what we mean by the party being a lifestyle. And I think I should maybe clarify for our American audience, because party politics here is so the opposite of that. To say, usually when you hear Americans talking about, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, well, they're not really quote unquote members of the party. There's no real party institutions. You're not involved in the party apparatus unless you're like
It,
on the paid staff of somebody's campaign or something, which is in reality very few people.
Yeah, here in America, it's almost like a consumer choice.
Yeah,
Which
it's
you're in.
just what you
Yeah.
mark on your ballot when election day comes, which is not at all how the SPD or any of the other parties in this period we were talking about were organized. They were, if you wanted, the parties were, membership organizations. You had to pay dues. You had to participate in the party activities. You had to, do something active. You had to essentially be a party activist in some way, even if you were. It was relatively minor. But and just to go off on a little bit of a tangent, this is ultimately what caused one of the schisms within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, which is this idea of what it means to be a party member. For the Mensheviks, it was a lot looser. It was like, okay, you pay your dues and you can participate in the party in some loosely designated way. The Bolsheviks were much more, or rather, this is how Lenin formulated it, wanted the party to be, to be a party member, you had to be an active, participating, full-time member. You had to go out of your way to go down to the factory floor and agitate with your working class comrades, and you had to, go out in the town square and hawk your copies of Pravda. So
Real quick, that's what Lenin would call a professional revolutionary. Is that
yeah,
right?
so
Okay,
yeah, again,
cool.
we're getting a little bit of a tangent here, but and this is maybe my specialty, knowing the Russian language a little bit. The way that the word professional revolutionary is translated, this is from Lenin's 1901, 1902 book, What is to be Done. A professional revolutionist what he means is somebody who's a full-time party activist, not somebody who's like, you know, uh, some kind of like, super Antifa super soldier, Bolshevik
Like I've
ninja.
I've been doing revolution since I was born. What do you mean? Like not
Yeah.
that.
No, what he means is somebody who's, full-time party activist. That's what they do. Anyhow, we're really getting off on a tangent here, so I'm gonna kind of just wrap up the question that I was trying to answer from Eve, which is what we meant by, what does it mean that the party was a lifestyle, uh,
To
the
the
pa- the
to
party
the point that
life.
you're sorry,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Simba.
you can go ahead.
Or is it? Oh, sorry, Kyle.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
no, it's me. I actually think what you brought up is really important. About sort of professional revolutionary, about the sort of what I think about with Eve's question, which I think is a very good question, is the changes that occurred in day-to-day life, and in general public living, throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and especially into the 20th century. There is something that's very unique that comes after the middle half of the 20th century, and I'm paraphrasing Henri Lefebvre here, but our private life, our everyday life has been, what he says, essentially colonized by consumption. There's this idea of the private ownership of public everyday life that is something that's very unique to sort of post-capitalist society after the 20th century, neoliberal society in particular. Our day-to-day lives are dictated more by consumptive patterns and practices, and rather than other affiliations, more now than they ever have been in the history of everything. There is no time more than now to where the practices, the motions, the rituals, the choices that we make in our day-to-day lives are limited by neoliberal capitalism. And before, this wasn't always the case. When we talk about the everyday life of being a member of a party in this time and place, remember that we're coming out of a context in which your affiliations were typically by locality. We're also coming out of the recently sort of like federated German states, which, as we talked about earlier, there's something that I think that we could have brought up, which is well, it actually did get brought up a little bit. The idea of sort of like a precariously constructed federal system or centralized system of government, it's in part just because there were like the regional states were essentially king, no pun intended. The governments were constructed in this area like not in a meaningfully way federally, but rather as a much looser connection of individual states. Up until the time period that we're talking about, 1871, unification of Germany. SPD formed in 1863. So as my comrades were saying earlier, kudos, that this is essentially, this is history told at light speed. What's happening in Germany right now. And to wrap up your question, apologies for rambling, but the differences between communications in our contemporary moment and communications in this time period is about the point and the goals of the communication. Now, a lot of that, there are some of us who are essentially trying to do some kind of party education online. We have YouTube channels and stuff where we talk about education and we're talking about Marxism and socialism. Essentially, we're all operating from a portion, at the very least, of the same template. However, outside of that space, it's mostly about the patterns of consumption that we find emerged in capitalism in the middle parts of the 20th century. So the differences between being a member of a party in the 19th century versus in the 20th century, especially the United States-European dichotomy, was extremely important to bring up. So that was perfect that my comrades on stream brought that up. But the differences in the way that we walk in our communities, the way that we interact with each other, is so unbelievably atomized in comparison to how it used to be. So the transition into a everyday life lived party member experience is something that makes a little more context moving into the 19th century rather than walking backward through the 20th century, because we've just been, our day-to-day life is I go get X, Y, and Z, and then I bring it back to the domicile that's private, that is fenced off, and that is for me and my nuclear family, my 2.1 kids. One of which you could see chasing his tail on the bed behind me during, I think, a point when Simba was talking, so I apologize for that. But anyways.
Never apologize for a pup. It's fine. We love doggies
all
here.
All dogs are comrades.
This is a dog stand channel.
Hell yeah.
Okay, so just to like condense everything you guys just said in like 2 minutes, tell me if I'm being inaccurate. So in, I believe it's Swahili, it's some sub-Saharan African language. There is a word for long-term cultural memory and short-term cultural memory. And I was actually surprised when I read, I think it's Lies My Teacher Told Me, that James Lowen, the sociologist, mentions this at the end of his book. But basically what you're saying is like our short-term cultural memory is like the current like pop trend, like which celebrity is going out with who or like whatever. But the existence of the party and the praxis involved with it is in a long-term cultural memory, and
Yes.
it's a part of everyday life.
Absolutely.
Is that more or less correct?
Sure, yeah.
Absolutely. Cool. And I want to actually, that's a really
So
good point that I want to get into, which is, there's a selection of essays by a couple of different authors called Party and Class, which I will link to in the comments in a minute. But it talks about kind of what's the relationship of what is the role of a working class party in revolutionary activity or just even in reformist activity, which is the party is supposed to be the collective memory of the class. That is, when you have an organization that can kind of be the scribe of working class history, or organization or organizations, could be plural. But the goal is so that, because we know from our experience, right, in capitalist society, that the history that we're taught through our public institutions, that's what Louis Althusser, the French communist, called the ideological state apparatuses. It's just a fancy word for things like schools and other institutions that teach us capitalist thinking, capitalist ideology, right? Capitalist history. We're kind of bombarded from our youths with this very capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal conception of history, and not just of history, but of just how society works, and the kind of rules and customs and norms that we're expected to adhere to. So the goal of a socialist party, of a working class socialist party, is to serve as the counter to that, right? If you are, yes, you're being indoctrinated at school, but if you also have an independent institution like a working class party or organization that can teach you, well, okay, well, this is the way you're taught about it in your public school, and here's what really happened. Here's, as we call it, history from below, history of our class, right? uh, I think you brought up lies my teacher told me a minute ago. I think that's very important. So a lot of the what we talk about, the importance of the role of a party, or if you don't like the word party because of its connotations, you could say organization, whatever. Point of having independent, working class, self-organized institutions like that is for us to have a collective memory of what's happened, our history as a class, and our uh, you know, we are given class consciousness through learning history that way, right? Because if you are, if you go through a public school and you're always in contact with history as this kind of story of great men or whatever, you don't feel connected to it. It's just a bunch of as many have put it before, dead white guys. Frequently, that's how it's taught. Um, and but if you read things like an indigenous people's history of the United States, if you read something like an African American and Latinx history of the United States, those are great books too. I'll link to them. These are things that they're still history, but they're history from a perspective uh, you know uh, of struggle. They're history through the lens of people who've been on the kind of the receiving end of society's oppression, right? And so the point of and I'll just wrap up by saying, the point of having these like a party, or an independent working class organization, call it a party, call it something else, is to be able to formalize that and be able to say, you've been uh, you know living in a bourgeois dream world, so here's a history, the way that it happened to us as a class, and that you feel not only kind of a more organic connection to history as a lived experience, but also um, your lived experience. If you're from an oppressed community, if you're non-white, if you're LGBT, etc. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so sorry, I'll wrap up in a second here, which is to say that if we and this is this I'll say this is part of my kind of polemical purpose in talking about these things in our stream, which is we need this again, especially in the United States, where the working class is divided along so many different
Yes.
class gender, racial lines, etc. And we need to create solidarity through collective education, which, in my opinion, is best done through the institution of some kind of working class party or organization. So I'll just bookend it there.
Cool. Yeah, it's like reading a comic book about like three people with superpowers versus taking a survey of how all the civilians feel about like the damage done to the city. You know,
Absolutely.
That's a
it's
very good illustration.
Well, I mean,
yeah,
it's kind of not to negate that, but it's kind of both actually. It's about reading about the superheroes and the civilians, right?
Yes.
Because when we talk about these histories, right, like especially, I think we talk about you know, um, I think this was really powerful about reading a book like Broué's History of the Revolution, of the German Revolution, which is that, yes, we'll hear about, the big names, Bebel, Bernstein, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, all those people, but, we're going to hear stories about, rank and file activists too. So,
Hmm.
it's not as if uh, great individuals, if you will, don't exist. Of course, they certainly emerge, but they're not. They don't emerge without context and without, millions of other people with them. And so, like I'll talk about a little bit from my background in physics, which is that. We talk about Einstein, and we frequently taught about him as some kind of, special genius, thought of everything in behind his desk with a pen and paper. And well, there's some truth to that. He's a very clever man, and he certainly put things together in ways that people hadn't thought of before. But he didn't emerge out of nowhere. He built on ideas from other great thinkers, mathematicians, and so on, other physicists, other mathematicians, Minkowski, Riemann, other tremendous thinkers who came before him and other contemporaries of his. Um, and so, we kind of emerge with this greater picture of, yes, Einstein was a brilliant man, no doubt about it, but he's not a great man with no other, you know, people connected to him. And we need to make sure that in our histories where yes, we talk about maybe our heroes here and there who emerge, but they don't emerge without context and without interconnection. And that's what we mean when we talk about uh, dialectics, right? We're talking about the interconnections between people, the masses, the individuals, all these diverse and novel interconnections that kind of go unexamined by everyday thinking about history and social reality more generally.
Yeah, Marx was into intersectionality before it was cool, I
Oh
guess.
hell yeah. Yeah, I get
um,
all these people calling him a class reductionist. I think
yeah,
I
there
mean,
you
I think
go.
what the whole point of Marx is, or not just Marx, but and the folks who've carried on his tradition is that the other isms of society, racism, sexism, transphobia, etc., are not separate issues. They're constitutive of class division. They're
Mhm.
constitutive of these aspects of class society that we're so intimately familiar with. They are the mechanisms through which class inequality and class um, uh, antagonisms are most visible, right? Police violence and the black community, for example, in the United States, that's an absolutely horrific manifestation of that kind of thing. So yeah, I have to agree with that.
Okay. Just changing gears a little bit here. I have a question for both of you. Um, and I think you might have differing responses to this. So this is coming from the Wikipedia page of Pierre Broué. It says the French Communist Party expelled these organizers. They said that Broué suffered from Trotskyism, and that is like a quote. They said that Broué like suffered from Trotskyism as if it were like some kind of disease. And obviously, we're not so dogmatic that we write off every element of Trotskyism like just out of hand. I personally think that it's a flawed argument, that whole thing. But given that Brouet was so inflicted with Trotskyism, what do you think were the most Trotskyist moments, or like what do you think stood out, like from a Trotskyist perspective about like this text? Because
Kyle, you want to
I
get into that first? I
yeah.
I have some thoughts on that, but I've been talking for a while. Do you want to pick that up, Kyle?
I mean, sure. I think there are elements of I'm certain that the elements of Brouet's Trotskyism will become even more evident as you go along. I mean, there are some evidence points that emerge, in particular in the I believe it was, I can't remember which section it was in, that had the big block quote from Trotsky. I think it was chapter 1. You can see in some instances for him, Trotsky had the answer, and it, but I think I mean the thing that jumps to mind is the like the idea of continuing revolution, whether or not like a large concept like, say, the continuing revolution, it like presents itself within the context of Broué's text. I can't necessarily see that yet, but I'm sure that we would be able to frame that within like a sort of a Trotskyist analysis, as we move on further. And in the meantime, I think that's part of what I find so interesting about the book. As I was describing earlier, the sort of the apparent influence, at least from me, from sort of the French Annales school of historiography, is what made itself most evident to me right away. And that could be just because I'm always looking for historical methodologies, and so as a result, it jumped out to me quite a bit. But I think what's so interesting about the book is how he's prioritizing him. So even as the guy who was like making the Trotsky archive, which he was as he was releasing this book, who was, you know, like all of us have, like for example, fucking fun fact, fucking Pete Buttigieg's dad, for example, who was a very prolific translator of Gramsci. A lot of people who do scholarship along with a scholarship that's more representative of their politics find these little sort of projects based off of their political affiliation, and then use that alongside of larger findings and ideas and beliefs around, say, in this case, historical methodology. I think about something that I had a little shameless plug for myself that I dropped into chat. We were talking about instances of people's history. I had an article published by this group called the Activist History Review. It's a bunch of academics who basically wanted to start a publication that doesn't shy away from being political and historical writing. It fucking rules. That piece in particular was on Raphael Samuel and the History Workshop, an organization that I think has some really interesting ideas, but as I sort of gesture to in the piece, wasn't really Marxist enough, is the main problem. But I bring that up because they're an additional example of this simultaneous thought that's occurring on for left historians. The History Workshop emerged from the splits in the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, that were occurring during the sort of more heavier Stalinization periods of the party. And then, as with a lot of people, the party split during the Hungarian Revolution. Some people stayed with the party line, and then a group of historians broke away and started the Communist Party Historians Group. Well, no, they were the Communist Party Historians Group. This group broke away, and they started a very famous journal for socialist history called Past and Present. It included people like Raphael Samuels. E.P. Thompson is a big notable one. And these individuals were in many ways positioning themselves both simultaneously outside of the Stalinization of the party, putting distance between themselves and the Soviet Union, while at the same time putting a distance between themselves and certain elements of historical methodology. You brought up Althusser, for example. Althusser was the main antagonist for E.P. Thompson and these people's historians in the UK. Because there's an essay, and I can't remember the name of it. There's a video on my YouTube channel where I talk about this quite a bit. I've read, you have to read a lot of E.P. Thompson when you go into history for grad school and for undergrad too. But there's this conflict to where E.P. Thompson is basically saying that he's aiming squarely at Althusser, but these fucking theorists with their head in the clouds have no idea about the lived experiences of individuals who find themselves in these actual places, and they have no idea what they're talking. Like just real, like some real like academic polemicist like bullshit, real salty stuff. But as Melody was talking about, and Simba, you too, a little bit, there's this process of reconciliation that we have between the mechanisms of our politics and our understandings of an academic field, how we want to use sources and how we want to apply them. And it's funny that you brought that up, and then Simba, you asked this question, because I think they actually relate to each other in the ways in which people like Louis Althusser and E.P. Thompson were essentially simultaneously experiencing these changes in political ideologies alongside of their changes in the approach to history, or even digging in their heels a little bit to the approach in history. Now, I fall a little more on the side of the structuralists, like Althusser. However, I think the most interesting example of historiography done with people's history in mind is something like this book. Now, this isn't a people's history by any means. It does not use sources in the same ways that people's historians do. It is closer to the top down rather than the bottom up. However, I think there's a reconciliation that occurs here because of this French Annales school of historiography that Broué is finding himself sort of, at least I find him sort of embodying a little bit. The idea that I cannot limit my analysis of these particular events in this time based off of the interactions between important people. This counts even when we're writing about left-wing history. It's very clear that he understands this, because then he needs to contextualize it within the broader mechanisms and movements of the party, and he also needs to contextualize it with the rest of the history that's being told about this. That's why he keeps coming back to, now people have said this about these events, and I don't think they're right. People have said that about events, and I don't think they're right either. And so what I don't, to answer your question, Simba, that was a big, long thing. I don't necessarily see the sort of intrinsic embodiments of Trotskyism outside of his references to Trotsky. What I do see is, one, that's going to emerge at some point, and as we have more of the text under our belt, we'll definitely be able to do that. And that's a really important part of this entire thing, I think, the intellectual biography of Broué himself. And then in the second part, I think I see something of a reconciliation that is not just happening here. Politics, changes in historiography, changes in approaches, creating some mishmash, some fucking paste putty of the two, some reduction. That this is an historical thing that people on the left and who do history or who do academics or who write theory or whatever have to figure out. And that I just, in general, I think it's a very interesting representation of that historical problem, so to speak.
Sure. So Kyle covered that a lot better than I could, because he's a historian and I'm a physicist, and but I'll do my best to answer it in kind of the shortest way that I can, which is that I'm not a Trotskyist myself. I'm a Marxist-Leninist, and but I still think reading these historians who maybe don't come from one's own tradition is still important, because you're able to kind of see where the points of, it's still important to understand the contradictions of okay, here's how they're telling this history, how is it told by others. It's still an important distinction to understand where what methods they used versus what methods others used, what sources they referenced, and how they talk about certain figures and so on. But I think despite Broué being a trot, he's actually spoken up by we all know Professor Grover Furr, who's certainly a staunch anti-Trotskyist, and even he speaks relatively highly of Broué in some of his work. And so I think, but specifically when we're talking about Trotskyism, I think there's something else that we have to bear in mind, which is kind of the other historically specific factors of both the period that Broué is writing about and the period in which Broué is writing. So Trotskyism kind of reached the peak of its influence in, I'd say, the 30s and 40s. That was kind of when it was most popular and relevant in terms of what impact it was making on the socialist movement, and I think kind of reaches the peak of its influence in the United States in the 50s. with the kind of the split between the canon, the wing of the American Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party, between James Cannon, who was much more left wing, and the kind of centrist wing of it, which was headed by guys like Max Shachtman. And the so you know just to and then to go back to what I had kind of opened with, which was to consider the time in which Broué was writing, which is I believe this was first written. This was first written in the 1970s, and this is where kind of the influence of Trotskyism had kind of waned. I think in terms of its overall political impact. But this is also kind of coincident with the emergence of in the 1970s of neoliberalism, of the kind of both the bankruptcy of social democratic parties and other leftist parties within um, you know within capitalist states and so on, uh, and so socialism was and just leftist politics in general were definitely on the outs in the U.S. I'd call it the Eurosphere, both the U.S. and continental Europe. Um, so I think, and granted, I don't know the grand sweep of the world's the world history of the Trotskyist movement, but my general impression is that after Trotsky was assassinated in 1940, that the influence of his both the parties that uh, followed him and intellectuals who derived their um, political philosophy from him in some way, it was kind of began its decline. That's my without citing any sources there, unfortunately. That's my understanding of the general sweep. But I personally, I'm going to defer to Kyle on a lot of this stuff because I'm, again, not a historian and I don't really have the methodological wherewithal to be like, okay, Broué is referencing X, Y, and Z, and that's a bunch of Trotskyist nonsense and or whatever. I think it's important to kind of bear that in mind, that that's his bias and that's um, his overall, what informs his writing. But I think, we still have a 1,000 page history to read here, and I don't think we should just throw it in the trash on the account of Broué being a dirty trot or whatever.
Yeah, being
We've got
afflicted
quite
with
a bit of history
Trotskyism.
to excavate here, and if we run into those issues, certainly we can discuss them. Um, I think just in the case of the current portion of the book that we're reading, I haven't been able to discern myself if that's
Neither have
at
I.
play here. But like again, I wouldn't really have the wherewithal to do so. So yeah, let's bear that in mind for both ourselves as readers and discussing this on a public platform, because it's going to be available for everyone to listen to afterwards. Um, that again, we're not a bunch of history professors. We are learning this stuff kind of as we go along, and we may have some peripheral knowledge, but again, I think we should be modest about our um, the kind of the span of our abilities here. So that's what I'll say about that. I hope that answers your question, Zimba.
Well,
Yeah, definitely.
I want just to jump in very quickly. One, I think that's absolutely true. It's a reflection of the way that we acknowledge the biases of others as well as we acknowledge our own strengths and limitations, and to do so in a way that possesses class consciousness requires to get rid of our fucking classist bullshit, the bougie ass bullshit that sort of seeps itself into the way that we construct our relationships. And to that point that you were making about sort of I typed out the word Trotskyist historiography because I'll go ahead and in between this one and the next stream, I'll try and piece together some kind of a Trotskyist historiography, like historians who have engaged in certain topics who were Trotskyist, what topics they engaged in. I'll do a little like side hustle shit. So we can maybe discuss that in depth, and then I'll send it to y'all, and then I'll do an outline or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. But at some point, I just wanted to say for everyone who's listening too, when we do this again, we can go into more depth about how Trotskyists have written history before. This historiography shit is not that complicated. It's just there's a barrier to entry sometimes based off of terminology. But I'll just look into that, and then we can all sit down and talk about it, because I think that's a fucking great point of inquiry here and really important for reading works of history. That's the real sophisticated shit. Like, you know, that's the inside baseball for everyone at home. Like, you want to get sophisticated with it, talk about how historians write. That's it. Like, the philosophy of historical writing. That's what historiography is. That's it. So we can and absolutely should get into that kind of a thing. I'll start piecing some stuff together and thinking about it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Also, I do have to leave in about 10 minutes. So if it's all right, I'd like to like go around the proverbial table and have everybody say like, hey, why should people care about what happened in Germany 100 years ago in general, and why should people care about this book in particular?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I wanted to do with this portion of our discussion. So actually, Simba, since you have to leave the soonest of us, why don't you give us your opinion on that if you're prepared to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. So coming into this as somebody who is not academic, who is not a layman, who does not know a whole bunch about the German Revolution, and is also not a Trotskyist, this is, you know, even though I'm very much inspired by Marx and his successors, and both in like a literary and historical context, this is foreign territory for me. And so learning about the SPD, like specifically, and the civil, like the I guess just like the cultural turmoil that Germany was going through at the time, was very interesting, especially considering that Germany was like one of the most industrialized places on the planet, and learning about the different contradictions that they had in their country versus ours today, as well as learning that knowing that their revolution was not successful where it was in more backwards places, against the predictions of Marx and Engels, was like very, very interesting. And I don't exactly know how to word it, but I feel like learning about especially the reactions that the right wing had and the reactions that the left wing had and the reason that the left wing splintered does like inform me in some sense about like what is the DSA doing, and are they likely to splinter in the way that they did, and like, you know, what is the IWW doing? Like you have like it gives me a different perspective on both the cultural memory of organizations in general, and like what did the organizations like, what are the organizations like the SPD today, and I don't really think that there is like an equivalent that I personally can think of, because we don't really have that cultural memory, but knowing that there was a cultural memory that existed for the SPD gives me some idea of how to construct that today. And for talking about this book specifically, you should read it, because everybody should know about, like, every good Marxist should know about like the most number of things that you possibly can. Like, there's no kind of information that's bad for you to know, basically, when it comes to history, if you're a Marxist. And if you are a Marxist in the first world especially, you should know at least a thing or two about the revolution that happened in the most industrialized, or one of the most industrialized countries on the planet. I'm sorry if that was a little bit rushed. I'm just,
Hey, it's fine. I mean, you know, if we want to be respectful of your time and make sure you're able to talk about the things you want to talk about, so that's good. And And yeah, absolutely, we really need to make this discussion as kind of germane to the contemporary political landscape as possible. You know, we're living in the United States, I think, all of us. So I think our conversation will inevitably be a little bit US centric, and that's okay. It's just something we need to be mindful of. And yeah, I think Simba, just going off of what you said about, comparable institutions to the SPD, we really don't have any. The closest thing that we could talk about, I think, it would be like the DSA or something. But again, the DSA, I think, has 60,000 members right now, which granted is bigger than it's been in many decades, but also, the SPD was a party of millions. Um, so it's a point of comparison in terms of scale is really quite different, and we're also another thing that I think, what's really important is to not, despite the fact that we can draw historical lessons from past events, we need to be very careful about what those lessons are, that we're not, just kind of transhistoricizing things willy nilly, and that we're not just, so, oh, it's just like last time or whatever. I think that that's a kind of a reductive, schematic way of thinking about it. So I'll just say that, yeah, I think kind of the contradictions of reform or revolution, those are big questions that we are wrestling with on the US left today, especially when we talk about things like, Bernie Sanders or, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the kind of the crop of left-ish, vaguely leftish uh, candidates coming up in the Democratic Party. Kind of it connects to my discussion on my channel, videos about the history of the Democratic Party and the relation of the socialist movement to it. So there are a lot of things that we can talk about in that context. And I think one thing that I think I want to take just a moment to clarify some terminology, which is this term call that we keep kind of referring to of reformism and revisionism. So I think we should be very clear about what those mean in this context. So revisionism isn't just kind of an insult that you hear every other Maoist shouting at you. I mean, granted, it is also that, but
Yep.
revisionism in the context of the German Revolution is talking about um, the politics surrounding Edward Bernstein, who literally, he was revising, self-avowedly so, revising Marx's theory, because his observation was, okay, capitalism in Germany seems to be doing all right. I think we're going to be out of the woods in terms of crisis and stuff. There's not going to be any problems. We can kind of legislate our way into socialist power, and
Imperialism is okay.
yeah, and imperialism, we'll just kind of not talk about that.
Yeah.
So that is, and so Bernstein and the kind of the center or right wing of the SPD was definitely, um, that is what we mean when we're talking about revisionism. And reformism, we should say very carefully here, is um, the focus on reforms as ends in themselves, right? Rather than, so, for example, Kautsky represents an interesting kind of confluence here, which is that he believed ultimately, revolution would be necessary to achieve socialism, but that reform, we need to struggle for reforms along the way. And Luxemburg, of course, took this even further, which is that you know reform the question of reform or revolution isn't so black and white, right? We have workers are struggling for their daily bread, and we can't just kind of wait for some ineffable future revolution. We have to work to construct it, and sometimes fighting for reforms is um, can be like a means for building working class agency, granted that it's done in the context of with revolutionaries continually saying this isn't enough, we need to go further, we need to go further, and so on, right?
Yeah,
Um,
always ask for the next thing.
right, exactly. The whole principle that kind of the left wing of the SPD, like Luxemburg, Leibniz, and all those people were um, going for was which was all about building the agency and power of the working class, independent from the kind of machinations of capitalism and imperialism. And it's also why you find the most consistently anti-imperialist threads within the party are in that left wing, within that revolutionist wing. For example, like in Rosa Luxemburg's masterwork, The Accumulation of Capital, she's very explicit about the imperialism and colonialism being big driving factors under the capitalist system. Lenin would
Lenin too. Yeah.
put those things much more concisely in his pamphlet, but Luxemburg, I think, is kind of underrated in that way because this
Mhm.
her book is 400 something pages and Lenin's is very short, but Luxemburg's is definitely worth reading. So if you or any of our audience wants to check that out, her book is called The Accumulation of Capital. It's if you're feeling ambitious, you can look into reading that. We may even talk about it on future streams, depending on the kind of feedback we get. But
Right.
so I hope that answer, and I'll just want to hand it back to you, Simba, if you want, because we're
Yeah, I do like
running
have
up
to go.
against the clock here. So if you want to say anything before you head out, please indulge us.
Yes. Okay. So immediately after saying this, I'm gonna peace out. So, um, great talking to y'all. Both of you are beautiful, wonderful people who I hope to speak to many, many times in the future. Um, you can find me on social media at yo_it's_Simba or young Simba, like on pretty much everything. On Twitter, I'm young Simba, and feel free to reach out to me for anything. Big things coming soon on YouTube. The issue is when. um, in other news, peace, love, join the IWW.
Hell
Be
yeah!
realistic, demand utopia. What else? Profit is the unpaid wage of the working class. Stay classless, you guys.
Hell yeah! Join the
Yep, yep.
Wobblies. Take care, Simba.
Yep,
Thanks for
peace out.
joining us.
Absolutely. Hope to see you guys next time. Peace.
Bye, comrade.
All right. Kyle, did you want to? We can keep talking if you've got time for it. But we are at the 2 hour mark, so I understand and respect if you've got to take off too. But you're welcome to hang out, and we can keep talking for a little bit longer if you'd like.
I got a smidge of time. I probably got about 10 minutes left. But
Sure. Well, I'll
it
let you take the spotlight. You fill this time up with whatever you'd like. You can. I think we should maybe stay on the topic of how this German Revolution relates to our current political moment in the United States or elsewhere, even if you're familiar with non-U.S. politics. I'll admit that that's definitely not my strong suit, but I think that's maybe what we should keep our discussion centered on for the remaining time. So yeah, or if you feel like you want to talk about something else, go for it. It's all you.
Sure, yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Well, and it relates to what Simba was talking about, trying to they were essentially trying to contextualize their approach to this particular book within the broader context of our stream, goals, ideas, what they want to accomplish, and I follow along a very similar line with a lot of this. In general, if we're talking about using this historical information, event, biography, all of these little like tidbits, these little morsels that we get from our historical sources and how they're repackaged in something of a way. I always think about two things. First is how exactly are we framing historical education within the context of the left? which is a very contemporary question, something that we don't think about enough. And that the reason why is because we lack the sort of concrete party structure that existed that allowed people like Rosa Luxemburg to make their living as party educators. That apparatus doesn't really exist. So it's the impetus is on individuals who are, say, from the field of history, say, who have been educators for history for anywhere from children. For me, it was middle school. I taught middle school, and then to undergraduates and adults too, and in other sort of public lectures, which I've done with the Unitarian Church and through so just more public history organizations and government organizations, that kind of a thing. The point of engaging with a text like this, at the very least for me, is that there's, of course, the building the knowledge of the past left, which is one of my main priorities right now, essentially filling gaps that I have in my own personal knowledge. This is a very useful way of doing that. I know there's stuff I know less about than the German Revolution, but it is not in my top 3 know the most about it ideas, that kind of a thing. So it's because I truly believe that those approaches to sort of historical information are very formative. I think a lot of us can say, at least for me, I know that my radical political education came as a result of engaging with historical ideas. I was always into history. I was that kid who liked old shit, basically. I liked to read. This was the context I found myself in. I read a lot of theory and philosophy and literature. I very easily could have gone into English literature in undergrad or something, but this is where I ended up because my education came from others figuring out how to communicate these ideas in a way that helped build class consciousness and political education. Historians like Howard Zinn, writers like, I wouldn't call myself a Chomskyan or anything, but Chomsky did a lot for me early on. Having a good teacher essentially hand me Chomsky was a big deal when I was 16. So that my first priority is, the way that it helps formulate political education, understanding these historical ideas, especially revolutionary like contexts, and especially revolutionary contexts that are so unbelievably and thoroughly under fucking rated, like the German Revolution is. And then the other half I think about is the role of educators in history, how we are taking responsibility to think about how we're discussing historical ideas, not just which historical ideas that we're talking about. So that's both how our pedagogy is formed outside of the classroom. I firmly, very much believe that it is. My own personal pedagogy is a little more egalitarian, I would say, than others, and is a little more loosey-goosey in some ways. Not always. I've done strict lectures. I do that. You can't do anything besides that in an AMH 2010 class with about 275 students was the biggest class that I've had at my current university. And it's also technically the biggest school in the country. So
that's a lot of undergrads. Holy shit.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Oh, I'm so sorry, comrade.
Yeah, I love many of these undergrads dearly. They're wonderful and they're lovely, and they don't even deserve to be shoved in a fucking room with another 250 of themselves. So it's a testament to the bloat of the contemporary American university system and its inability to actually deal with it appropriately. But nonetheless, I think about a lot of the ways how I am incorporating myself into working class education. And I believe this is a big part of it, actually, not only because the discussions that we're incorporating ourselves in as members of the left who are trying to push people left and talk about build class consciousness and discuss historical ideas, we need to give our perspective because otherwise people are just going to fill in the blanks for us. And we know they do a really fucking bad job of it. The idea is that, we're going to be in spaces like this, sure, but also when we're setting up, like Mel, like to very much to your credit, you set up this stream and the previous one in such a way to where everyone is serving some kind of a role, contributing to the discussion itself, and that pedagogically, it's very productive. The way that I see like what we're doing here and what you've set up for us, and so. Yeah. It's important and it matters to me. I truly believe that as someone who does education, I have a responsibility to incorporate myself within discussions like this that are outward facing, that are public facing, and from which I can get a great deal of information talking to friends about books, which fucking rules. So it's all just basically to say my approach with the book in a lot of ways is going to be about methodology, about pedagogy, about communicating ideas. However, the most important part of all of this is what y'all have already brought up a couple of times, which is that the typical demarcations between the type of people who should be having a discussion or leading a discussion like this, the type of people who should be at the helm of political education and discussion, is fucking bullshit. It's a framework that's been created by liberals in order to keep bourgeois fucks in the positions in which they have, either implicit. I don't believe it's all explicit. I think a lot of it is implicit. But a lot of people have internalized a set of values that say that because of X, Y, or Z thing, someone is more capable of obtaining understanding than somebody else. And sure, there are absolute differences between, like, the concrete material differences between someone who's able to afford formal education and someone who isn't, that sort of a thing. I'm in no way denying that that's the case. But what I'm instead discussing is the idea that presence in an environment, a presence of mind that was formulated by the academy is fucking trash. It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. People make that shit up because they want you to go to their school and listen to them talk. Well, the principle here is that absolutely we should learn from people who have a great deal of knowledge. Absolutely we should defer to experts and defer to authorities and that sort of a thing. However, that our values in terms of approaching education are formulated in the way that we educate ourselves and each other. It's not created by the academy. It doesn't fucking trickle down, because this isn't fucking like imaginary Ronald Reagan land. It's also formulated and constructed by us.
Yes.
So those of us who are class consciousness and understand that, like, even if I were to go get a tenure track job, which the chances in the humanities is next to fucking nothing in this day and age, there's a
it's not much better for me either.
No, definitely not. Exactly. Like, in
there
general,
were almost no full-time faculty in my physics department. Like, holy shit, it was mostly adjuncts.
Yeah, over half of the people who are teaching at universities and colleges in the United States are part-time. The adjunctification has already happened. And it doesn't matter if you're STEM. It doesn't matter if you're in the humanities either. We're all on the chopping block.
Yep.
So those of us who are straddling these worlds between this public and this sort of academic life, who are facing toward working class education, need to continually and constantly participate in a dialectic of re-emerging ourselves amongst our peers and really the people who have our back. And that's the people who are on the stream, the people that as opposed to the upper echelons of the fucking, university that I work at.
Which is all to say, like, this is kind of the point that we've been driving home since we started our stream with, last, or 2 months ago now, I guess, with on New Terrain, which is that this is about, reclaiming history for us, right? History doesn't belong to the bourgeois, it belongs to everyday people, and the idea that, we brought up with Simba a little while ago is that, because of the way history is taught in our institutions, it comes off as boring and unrelatable because, well, it is. And the way that we give it life is not just by, breaking it down and talking about it in our study groups. But this is. I really hope that this kind of practice, what I'm trying to maybe I'll just address our audience here directly a bit, which is to say, again, we are not a panel of experts. We're not a bunch of, people in a university, with the exception of Kyle. No offense. But, which is to say, pick up one of these books. Maybe it doesn't have to be a big, fat one like this one that we're reading, but, pick up a book of history or theory that you'd like to break down and find some comrades either in real life or online, or maybe a little both, and don't be afraid to dig into them. I've had friends that get together and read through. We've read through parts of, like, Capital by Marx, and we've read through different works of history and political theory, and I think this is kind of the point, which is to really reclaim our agency. It's not, some obscure discipline that's done by bigwigs in the ivory tower. It's something, history. we participate in history directly by, exerting agency in our everyday lives, but then we also participate in the discipline of history by 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 reading and discussing and, thinking about, well, what's our role, and this is how I think class consciousness, it can emerge somewhat organically from doing history in this way, which is to say, we all as working class people get together and talk about history from our perspective and think about our place within it, and that's what, kind of gives us the impetus to act and to say, hey, we're being fucked over by this system, and not only have people before us fought back, sometimes they've even won. And
Yes.
we can absolutely make that happen again. And I think that's also the important of just to bring this back to the Broué book. This is the importance of studying the revolutions that lost, because we can learn from their failures, and we can learn from their near misses, and so on. Um, and I think one thing that I think is really pertinent about the German Revolution, and Simba brought this up, which was, uh, and again, we're trying to discuss the relevance of the German Revolution to kind of the current political context, which is that, Marx and Engels thought rather strictly that um, that the revolution would happen in the most developed countries, in
Right.
the because that's their theory was that, you need to have the developed abundance of capitalism in order to
Yes.
then have a working class which is educated and cultured and aware, self-aware in that sense. Um, and they turned out to be objectively quite wrong about that, because the first place to undergo a revolution in the kind of the under the Marxist influence was, of course, Russia, which is quite the opposite of what they had assumed. They had assumed that revolution would occur uh, primarily or first in the industrialized countries. Well, Russia was one of the most, economically underdeveloped countries of the
Yeah.
kind of the Eurosphere at the time, which is just as a quick aside, Russia still had, Imperial Russia, that is, had
Mhm.
pockets of highly developed industry. In fact, like the Pudilov metallurgy was one of the most advanced factories in the world at that point. So to say that Russia was strictly a backwards country is a bit reductive. But
Right.
anyhow, um, but it's to say that um, you know, the other thing that I think is really relevant is in Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He talks about the role of the labor aristocracy. And I think this is important in the context of the German Revolution, because they see that the kind of the spoils of colonialism and imperialism have a definite impact on the politics of deeply institutionalized socialist organizations, even if they are deeply rooted in the working class. And I think that that's especially true in the United States, even though we don't have a comparable institution to the SPD. There's still definitely, the kind of bourgeoisified labor organizations like the AFL and the
Hmm.
even the unfortunately even the Teamsters have kind of they refuse to acknowledge things like imperialism, or they really kind of uh, try to stay away from real politics, and just kind of they frequently say, well, let's just stick to bread and butter issues,
Hmm.
which is, to say, very reductive and economistic. Um, and so I think that that's also very pertinent to our contemporary political landscape. And Kyle, you look like you're agreeing to go there, so I'll let you say any of your parting words, and then I'll wrap up the stream.
Oh yeah, no. I just want to say thank you to chat and everyone who's watching. That we were all very excited for this, and it went very well. We're very pleased. At least I am. I'm excited for more, and I just hope you come back. And also that you can find me at a bunch of links. I'm laborkyle on everything. I wrote the links out. I can copy them. I know links in YouTube Live is not great.
Go
I'm
for it.
gonna paste them in. Fuck, that didn't work well. We're gonna try it one more time. I'm gonna paste it again, and I'm gonna put a space in between the links. You can copy and paste them if you like. Anywho, I make videos on YouTube. I have an essay that was put up about a month ago. That's on the differences between ideology in the Third Reich and Marxist ideology. Also, I have another video. It's a book review about that's a book about slavery in the United States and capitalism that'll be coming out tomorrow. So you can subscribe and see that. And then if you haven't followed me on Twitch, just go follow, and then come hang out sometime. I like to play Pokemon and talk about theory.
And I'm always there.
Yes, exactly. Everyone who's been on, everyone like Simba too. Everyone has jumped in on Twitch, and I love that Twitch stream, and it's not my doing. It's the doing of a whole bunch of very cool people who stop by and chill. We're the come down stream at the end of the night. If you're like hammered and you come home and you need someone to just talk quietly and be like, "Hey, what's up?" It's the Twitch stream for you. So check it out. Follow me on stuff on Twitter too. I'm constantly tweeting, and I have content coming out that I hope everyone will enjoy. That straightforward. Here's some stuff. Watch it if you have some time, and I'd appreciate it. And that's it, really.
Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you have a good evening. Really thank you for your work. We all worked very hard to carefully study this book and bring it to our audience. And I'd also like to thank our audience for sticking with us for this whole time. And we hope that this has been beneficial for you. And if you'd like to follow along in the book, we're going to be doing more of these in the future. So if you'd like to follow along in the book, get in contact with us. We'll help you get your hands on a copy, either a physical copy or a digital copy, whichever is best for you. As I said earlier, Haymarket Books has a sale going on right now, 50% off for the holidays. So you can get your hands on this book for just $25. Which is an absolute steal given the quality and just, oh my gosh, $25 for this book is ridiculous. But yeah, make sure you just get your hands on a copy, and we'll be back to talk about this probably in a couple weeks. I'm guessing just depends on everyone's schedule. Hopefully, Izzy will be able to join us for that one. But Kyle, thank you so much, and I'll let you go.
Sounds good. Thank you. And I'll catch everyone later. Thanks, Melody. Y'all.
Yeah.
You're the best.
So, Kyle just left us, but I can keep talking for just a minute. I don't have a whole lot more to say other than to just kind of wrap things up. And thank you, Kyle. But yeah, so if you enjoyed this, please tell your friends about it in real life. Tell your comrades, tell your friends on social media. Make sure to go and subscribe to my channel on YouTube, A World to Win. I've got a series of videos on the history of the Democratic Party, and I'll be continuing that in the meantime. Make sure to follow us, all of us, on Twitter. Our handles are all up on the screen now. You can see them. And we hope that you will join us in the future. And yeah, just as a quick wrap up, I again want to stress that the whole point, we bring up this word, Kyle likes to use this word, I like to use it too, pedagogy. We like to talk about pedagogy or pedagogy a lot. And just for those who aren't familiar with this term, pedagogy is just basically a teaching style. Doesn't mean anything else other than, how you're being presented with information. So for example, a lecture in front of by a professor in front of a classroom full of students, that's a kind of pedagogy. a live stream YouTube book discussion group like this. That's also a certain kind of pedagogy. So pedagogy, for just shorthand reference, just means teaching style. Um, and I think before I get too rambly, I'll just go ahead and end the stream and thank you once again, all of you, for joining in and learning with us. Have a wonderful evening.